Story 1. The Blue Blood Detective. What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're starting with a story that comes from a retired homicide detective, and it's a chilling look into how a case that seems simple on the surface can unravel to reveal something truly monstrous. He says this case, more than any other, taught him about the art of investigation and the darkness that can hide behind a familiar face. Our story begins in 2001, just after Thanksgiving, in a small Pennsylvania town. The body of a 20-year-old woman is discovered on a local hiking trail called White Rocks. The first call to the police comes from her father, who presents a story that is every parent's worst nightmare. He claims that on Thanksgiving night, he and his daughter got into a terrible argument while driving home from a family gathering. He says she became hysterical and demanded to be let out of the car, so he pulled over and let her out. He admits he drove away angry, but after a few miles he cooled down and tried to call her to come and pick her up. His calls went straight to voicemail. Figuring she was still angry and would find her own way home, he left. A few days go by with no word. He files a missing persons report, and shortly after, her body is found. The crime scene itself was brutal. She was found with a plastic bag wrapped around her head, and the first responders on the scene initially thought she'd been suffocated. But the horrible truth was far worse. The medical examiner determined that the bag was the only thing holding her skull together. She had been killed by a single, devastating blow to the head from an object so heavy it had completely shattered the bone. As if that wasn't horrific enough, the investigators also discovered that she wasn't wearing any underwear, which immediately raised red flags about the nature of the attack. For most of the police department, the case seemed to have a clear, if circumstantial, suspect. While canvassing the area, officers interviewed a man who lived near the trail with a criminal history of indecent exposure and battery. This man's story was even more intriguing. He admitted to seeing the young woman that night. He claimed she had knocked on his door in a panic, telling him that someone was following her. He said he invited her inside for safety, but she suddenly became skittish, changed her mind, and ran off into the night. So now, the police have two narratives: a grieving father whose daughter ran off after an argument, and a local creep who had a strange encounter with her just before she died. The department, as you can imagine, focused all its energy on the man with the priors. The plan was simple: lean on him until he either confessed or they found forensic evidence linking him to the crime. But the detective who submitted this story had a partner, a man he calls Blue Blood, because he was a natural-born investigator. Blue Blood was different. He was quiet, methodical, and he had an intuition that was almost supernatural, while everyone else was chasing the obvious suspect. Blue Blood became fixated on a small detail that everyone else had overlooked. He spread a map out on the table and asked a simple question: why were they even out at White Rocks in the first place? He pointed out that the road where the father claimed he dropped her off was a complete detour. It wasn't on the way home from Gettysburg where the family had been. In fact, it was essentially a dead-end road leading to the trails. The father had said he knew the route like the back of his hand, so getting that lost was highly improbable. For Blue Blood, this wasn't just a wrong turn. It was, as he called it, the mystery reason. He started pulling on that one loose thread, and the entire sweater of the case began to unravel. He had the team go back and re-interview every friend and family member. During one of these interviews, a friend of the victim's mother let a crucial detail slip. She referred to the victim as the man's stepdaughter. This was the first time anyone had mentioned it. They weren't blood relatives. And then came the second bizarre detail. When the man had married her mother years ago, he had legally taken her last name. The detective says he knew then that his partner was onto something huge. Blue Blood brought the father back in for what he told him was just a routine taped statement. The father was calm, playing the part of the grieving parent perfectly. Blue Blood let him retell his story one more time, and then, with the tape rolling, he looked the man dead in the eye and said, "You're a liar." The room went silent. The father, of course, feigned outrage and immediately asked for his lawyer. When the interrogation resumed, Blue Blood's strategy was masterful. He started inventing a completely fabricated story. He told the father that they had found all sorts of scandalous messages on his daughter's laptop, that she was living a wild secret life, and he began listing off the names of fictitious boyfriends. The father sat there, on his lawyer's advice, saying nothing. But our narrator says you could see the change in his demeanor. He was becoming furious, but it wasn't the anger of a slandered, grieving father. It was the white-hot rage of a possessive and jealous man. He couldn't stand the thought of his stepdaughter being with other men. Finally, he broke. He slammed his fists on the table and screamed. She was not seeing anyone. Blue blood let that outburst hang in the air. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. He leaned forward and quietly asked, "No, she wasn't seeing anyone. And you know that for certain, don't you, Mr. Ross?" He used the father's original premarital last name. The man's face just crumbled. Blue blood laid it all out. The years of control. The deeply inappropriate and possessive relationship he had with his stepdaughter. The reason he changed his name was to create the illusion that she was his own flesh and blood. He knew she was planning to go to college to leave him, and he couldn't let that happen. The father, shaking with uncontrollable rage, finally screamed the words that sealed his fate. She was mine, was always mine, and now she'd be mine forever. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison, a monster hiding behind the mask of a loving father. Story 2. The burn unit. Every job has its tough days. But when you're a nurse, some days are more than just tough, they're haunting. This next story was shared by a nurse who says an experience she had in the burn unit one Thanksgiving has stuck with her ever since. The level of pain you witness there is honestly unimaginable, and it changes you. It's a place where you see human suffering at its most raw, and this one incident is a perfect example of that. She says the night started with a call that 2 burn victims were being rushed into their ICU. It was a man and a woman, both in critical condition. What made the situation even more intense was that they arrived with a police escort. The officers pulled the medical staff aside and gave them the shocking backstory. The male victim was a known pimp. The female victim was one of the women who worked for him. The story of how they ended up covered in horrific burns was something straight out of a twisted revenge film. Apparently, the pimp, the woman, and a few other girls who lived with them were trying to have some kind of Thanksgiving dinner. The woman, who was now fighting for her life in the ICU, had been in charge of the cooking. The nurse says she never got the full details of what led up to the incident, but at some point during the evening, an argument broke out, and the pimp, in a fit of rage, set the woman on fire. But here's where the story takes a turn that no one could have ever predicted. Instead of panicking, instead of screaming and trying to put the flames out, she did something else. With her body engulfed in flames, she turned to the man who had just set her ablaze, the man who had been controlling and abusing her. And she wrapped her arms around him in a final, fiery embrace. In her last moments, she made sure that if she was going down, he was coming with her. When the nurse first heard this story from a colleague, she said she didn't believe it. It sounded too much like something from a movie. But then she overheard one of the police officers confirming the entire story to the attending consultant. 3 other witnesses at the scene, all separated and questioned independently, told the exact same horrifying story. He had pushed her to the absolute brink, and she had chosen to take her own kind of justice. Tragically, the woman didn't survive her injuries. The nurse found out later that night that she had coded and passed away. The inhalation burns to her lungs were too severe. Pimp, on the other hand, survived. He had horrific, life-altering burns across his torso, face, and arms, but he was going to pull through. The nurse remembers a single, dark thought flashing through her mind when she heard the news. God took the wrong one tonight. It seemed like there was no justice in the world. That man did suffer, just not in a way any court could have sentenced him to. For the next week, he was kept in the ICU, under constant police guard and handcuffed to his bed. The nurse says the one time she had to change his bandages, the hateful way he looked at her made her skin crawl. But the real horror began for him when the lights went out. The night shift crew started reporting that he was having terrifying episodes. They would hear blood-curdling screams coming from his room and would rush in, thinking an intruder had somehow gotten past security. But every time, they found him completely alone in the room. He would be wide-eyed with terror, staring at an empty spot on the wall, screaming things like, "Get her off of me! Help, she's going to kill me!" He wasn't having nightmares. His eyes were wide open the whole time. He was fully awake, being tormented by something that only he could see. He was reliving the horror he had created, haunted by the ghost of the woman he had murdered. The nurse says the craziest part of the whole ordeal was the day he was finally discharged into police custody. Most inmates in that situation are anxious, angry, maybe even looking for a chance to escape. Not him. He was visibly, profoundly relieved. He actually thanked the police officer who came to cuff him as if the officer was his savior. He couldn't get out of that hospital room fast enough. It was clear to everyone that he was escaping something far more terrifying to him than prison. The nurse says it's the only experience in her career that has ever made her seriously wonder if a person's spirit can linger after death, coming back to claim its own kind of justice. Story 3. Stalkers and a Thanksgiving Nightmare. This next narrator shares a story about how the same holiday Thanksgiving was ruined for her twice by two different stalkers. Years apart, proving that sometimes real-life horror doesn't need monsters or ghosts, it just needs obsessive people with no boundaries. She says the first incident happened when she was only 13 years old. A 12-year-old boy in her math class developed a huge crush on her. But this wasn't some innocent passing childhood crush. He was a known problem in the school, a creep who would harass other girls in the hallways. When she politely rejected him, his crush twisted into a terrifying obsession. He started waiting for her at her locker every single day, not to talk to her, but to whisper vile, disgusting things to her as she tried to get her books. Then it escalated. He somehow managed to get a copy of her class schedule and began following her from class to class. A constant, unnerving shadow throughout her school day. She did everything she was supposed to do. She told her teachers, she told the school counselors, she even told the vice principal. But she says that nothing was ever really done to stop him. The best the school could offer was to change her class schedule around, which only worked for about a week before he figured out her new routine. His behavior grew even bolder. He started following her out to the bus stop after school, trying to figure out which bus she took home so he could find out where she lived. This campaign of terror went on for months, from the beginning of the semester all the way to Thanksgiving break. She was at her absolute breaking point. And then he had the incredible audacity to ask her out again, as if his relentless harassment was some kind of romantic gesture that would win her over. This time, she didn't just say no. She screamed it in his face, fueled by months of fear and frustration. He looked shocked for a second, but then his face twisted into an ugly sneer. He threatened her. He told her that he was going to come to her house on Thanksgiving Day with a gun and kill her and her entire family. That threat, finally, was enough for the school to take action. The principal had him transferred to a special school for kids with behavioral problems. The nightmare was finally over, or so she thought. 5 years later, she was home from college for Thanksgiving break. Before she had left for school, she had broken up with her high school boyfriend. She thought it was an amicable split, but he apparently did not agree. His sadness over the breakup festered and grew into a dangerous obsession. He started stalking her, tried to break into her mother's house one night while they were sleeping, followed her car around town, and she got a new vehicle. Called her workplace from a payphone next door just to tell her that he knew her new license plate number, a constant reminder that he was always watching. The harassment culminated that Thanksgiving weekend. She was walking downtown with a friend when he ambushed her on the street, attacked her, hitting her so hard in the face that he nearly fractured her orbital bone. That violent assault was the final straw. He was arrested and went to jail, but only for a few months. It wasn't a long sentence, but it was the window of opportunity she needed to escape. She moved to a town an hour away, changed her phone number, got a new job, and completely erased her social media presence. She had to build a new life from scratch, just to feel safe from him. She says that even now, years later, there's a part of that trauma that never leaves you. It changes the way you see the world. You're left constantly looking over your shoulder, always on edge, because you know firsthand what a person is capable of. And you know that if someone that dangerously obsessed ever finds you again, you might not get a second chance to get away. Story 4. The Thanksgiving murders of the Guy family. Now, this next story is a bit different. It's not a personal anecdote from a viewer. It's a well-documented true crime case. But it's so horrific, so deeply unsettling, that it belongs in any collection of scary stories, especially since the events unfolded on Thanksgiving weekend. It's a chilling reminder that the most horrifying acts are sometimes committed by the very people we presuppose to be able to trust the most. This is the story of the Guy family. It was Thanksgiving weekend of 2016, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Knoxville, Tennessee. The Guy family was gathered for the holiday. There was 61-year-old Joel Guy Sr., a successful pipeline engineer, and his 55-year-old wife Lisa, who worked in human resources. They were by all accounts a normal, happy couple who were looking forward to retirement. They had recently sold their family home and were planning to move to a new town to start the next chapter of their lives. This Thanksgiving was meant to be a special one, a final celebration in the house where they had raised their family. Also present was their 28-year-old son, Joel Guy Jr. On paper, Joel Jr. seemed like a bright young man. He had graduated from a prestigious and specialized school for math and science. But the reality was that despite his intelligence, he had never held down a real job. For nearly a decade, he had been drifting from one college to another, with vague aspirations of becoming a plastic surgeon, all while being completely financially dependent on his parents. He came home for Thanksgiving that year, just as he always had. His parents were excited to have their son home for this special final holiday in their house. They had no idea it would be the last day of their lives. The day was Saturday, November 26th. The holiday festivities were winding down. Lisa Guy decided to go to the local Walmart to pick up a few more groceries. Her husband, Joel Sr., went upstairs to their home gym to get a workout in, probably trying to burn off some of those Thanksgiving calories. He was alone, and he was vulnerable. At some point that afternoon, the door to the exercise room swung open. The doorway stood his son, Joel Jr., but the look on his face was not one of a loving son, home for the holidays. It was a look of cold, terrifying intensity. In his hand, he held a large knife. Before Joel Sr. could even react, his own son lunged at him, stabbing him repeatedly in a frenzied and brutal attack. Once his father was dead, Joel Jr. did not panic. He calmly and methodically cut the clothes from his father's lifeless body and placed them in a neat pile on the floor. Then, he went downstairs, sat in the TV room, and simply waited for his mother to come home. About an hour later, Lisa walked through the front door, her arms full of groceries, completely unaware of the horror that was waiting for her upstairs. She called out for her husband and son but received no answer. Thinking her husband must still be in the gym, she started to walk up the stairs. It was the last act of her life. As she reached the top of the staircase, her son ambushed her, plunging a knife so deep into her rib cage that the blade actually severed several of the bones. He stabbed her again and again until she lay still on the carpet. What he did next is almost too horrific to comprehend. Just as he had with his father, he cut the clothes from his mother's body. He then began the gruesome and extensive process of dismembering his own parents. He severed his father's hands at the wrists. He attempted to decapitate his mother, and according to the coroner's report, when the knife proved insufficient to cut through the bone, he used his own brute force to tear her head from her body. He then carried his mother's severed head downstairs to the kitchen, placed it in a large stockpot, filled it with water, and set it on the stove to boil. He returned upstairs and continued his monstrous work, systematically cutting off his parents' limbs and placing their disarticulated body parts into large plastic storage tubs that he had filled with a corrosive cocktail of industrial-strength cleaning chemicals. He had even taken the time to partially disembowel them, an act he believed would aid in the decomposition process. This was not a spontaneous crime of passion. This was a meticulously planned and researched execution. When the police eventually arrested him, they discovered a notebook in his possession, a journal that served as his own horrific to-do list for the murders. The entries were chillingly practical. Get carving knives. Sledgehammer to crush bones. Bring blender and food grinder to make meat into small pieces. Douse the whole area with bleach. Turn heater up as high as it goes to speed up decomposition. He had been buying these supplies for weeks, and in one final damning entry, he revealed his cold-blooded motive. The gruesome scene was discovered a few days later when Lisa's supervisor, concerned that she hadn't shown up for work, called the police to perform a wellness check. When officers arrived at the house, they were immediately struck by an intense wave of heat coming from inside, and a foul, overpowering odor. What they found inside was a house of horrors that seasoned officers would later describe as the most horrific crime scene they had ever witnessed. Joel Jr. was arrested at his apartment in Louisiana. The evidence against him, much of it in his own handwriting, was overwhelming. He had murdered the two people who brought him into the world. The two people who had supported him for his entire adult life, all for an insurance payout. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences and will spend the rest of his life in prison. He was forced to live with the knowledge of the monstrous thing he did in that quiet suburban home on Thanksgiving weekend. Story 5. A Thanksgiving surprise, you know. Sometimes the scariest moments are the ones that sneak up on you when you least expect them. You think everything is quiet and normal, and then your entire sense of safety is just shattered in an instant. This next story is a perfect example of that. It happened to a viewer a few years ago on Thanksgiving night. So they weren't going anywhere for the holiday. It's a long story, but they actually prefer spending it alone. So when their elderly neighbor asked if they could house sit for her while she went to visit her grandkids a few states over, they were happy to do it. The best part? She had this really sweet cat, so getting to give the little guy belly rubs was basically all the payment they needed. The first couple of days were great. It was super chill. They were going through her old cookbooks, trying out some recipes, just relaxing. It was a nice, quiet holiday, just the way they like it. On Thanksgiving night, they were stretched out on the couch, watching a movie with the cat curled up on their stomach. They must have dozed off, because the next thing they knew, they were waking up to the cat going absolutely crazy. The cat had jumped off their lap and was now standing in the hallway, hissing and growling at one of the back bedrooms. At first, our narrator just smiled to themselves. They had never seen a cat get that aggressive about wanting to be fed. They figured it was just his dinner time and he was being dramatic. So they got up from the couch, headed over to the kitchen to grab his food, and that's when they heard it. Voices. The distinct sound of people whispering, coming from the back of the house. Their blood ran cold. The neighborhood wasn't the best in terms of crime, and a holiday weekend is prime time for break-ins. They immediately thought that someone had seen the neighbor's car was gone and assumed the house was empty, breaking in to rob the place. Their hearts started pounding in their chest. The terrifying thought flashed through their mind. If I startle some armed intruder, this could be the end of me. You walk in the front door, and you're in the main living room and kitchen area. Then a single hallway leads to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom at the very end. The voices were definitely coming from down that hallway. Their mind was racing. They grabbed the biggest, sharpest knife they could find from the butcher block on the kitchen counter. With their other hand, they pulled out their phone and started dialing 911, their thumb hovering nervously over the call button. They began to creep down the hallway, every creak of the old floorboards sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. As they got closer, they could hear that one of the people was freaking out. But they were whispering, which was somehow even scarier. It meant they were actively trying to be quiet, that they knew they weren't supposed to be there. They could barely make out what was being said, as it was muffled by a closed bedroom door. But then they realized something that changed everything. The voice sounded young, really young. And it sounded like whoever it was, they were trying their best to hold back sobs. In that moment, a whole new instinct took over. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else. A strange mix of confusion and concern. They don't know why they did it, but instead of backing away and calling the police, they flung the bedroom door open and flipped on the light switch, half expecting to be confronted by a dangerous situation, half expecting to find someone who desperately needed help. And what they saw completely stunned them. Standing in the middle of the room were 2 kids. They couldn't have been older than middle school. They were the kids who went to the school just across the street from the neighborhood. They were just frozen, staring with wide, terrified eyes, looking like a couple of deer caught in the headlights. It turns out the initial suspicion was right, but the reality was just sad. They had been in the process of robbing the place. They had broken in earlier in the day, but our narrator had come home unexpectedly, and they had gotten trapped. They'd been hiding in that dark bedroom for hours, too scared to make a sound, waiting for a chance to sneak out when they thought it was safe. They didn't want to go to jail. They were just a couple of dumb kids who had made a terrible, life-faltering decision. Our narrator stood there for a second, a huge knife in one hand, their phone ready to call the cops in the other, just looking at these 2 terrified children. And all the fear they had felt just moments before just melted away, replaced with this weird sense of pity. Their lives were about to get a whole lot more difficult, all because they wanted to play act at being thugs. It was a scary night for sure, and their heart was pounding out of their chest for a good hour afterward. But it also gave a whole new meaning to Thanksgiving for them. That night, they were just thankful that no one got hurt, and that the biggest threat in the house was a couple of scared kids who just needed to be sent home. Story 6. The Drunk Uncle and the Gravy Family Holidays are supposed to be a time for joy and togetherness. But for anyone who has a complicated family, you know they can also be a minefield of tension, drama, and sometimes outright disaster. This next story is about a Thanksgiving that went from a typical family dinner to a traumatic trip to the emergency room, all thanks to one person's inability to handle their liquor and the chaos that followed. This happened to our narrator when they were just a kid. The whole extended family was gathered at their house for Thanksgiving dinner. Their uncle, who was already well known in the family for having a bit of a drinking problem, was particularly drunk this year. Turkey was carved, the mashed potatoes were steaming, and their mom had just placed 2 large full boats of freshly made gravy on the dining room table. The uncle, in his infinite wisdom, decides he needs to test the gravy. But instead of using a spoon like a normal person, he dramatically dunks his entire finger into one of the gravy boats, pulls it out, licks it clean, and then begins to complain loudly to everyone at the table that the gravy is cold. Our narrator's mom, who was already stressed out from having cooked and prepared for the entire family all day, was in no mood to deal with his antics. She curtly told him that if he wanted the gravy to be hotter, he could get up and microwave it himself. It was a simple solution to a simple and frankly ridiculous problem. So, the narrator watched as their uncle got up from the table, stumbled his way over to the kitchen microwave, and proceeded to nuke that boat of gravy until it was practically boiling. You could see the steam rolling off of it when he took it out. He then staggered back over to the crowded dining room table, holding this container of what was now essentially steaming molten hot liquid. And in one clumsy, drunken, and fateful motion, as he was trying to set it down, he lost his grip. He appended the entire boat of boiling hot gravy all over our narrator's little sister Slag. She was only 5 years old at the time. The sound she made wasn't a cry. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed through the entire house. It's a sound that the narrator says they will never ever forget. The entire dinner party instantly erupted into chaos. People jumped up from their chairs, frantically pulling the little girl away from the table. Someone else rushed to the kitchen sink to fill up a bowl with cold water to try and douse the burn and stop it from getting worse. In the midst of all that panic, our narrator got a clear look at their sister's leg, and the sight was horrific. The boiling gravy had literally just melted away some of her flesh. It was this hideous red raw patch of skin that was already starting to blister. It didn't look like a normal burn. It looked like something out of a horror movie. It wasn't bleeding like a normal cut would. It was just this angry, weeping wound on her tiny leg. She was screaming so loud and for so long that one of their neighbors, hearing the commotion, actually called the cops. They didn't even come over to check on them first. They were so alarmed by the sound of her screams that they bypassed calling for an ambulance and called the police directly. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, and they had to rush the little sister to the hospital. The burn was so severe that she ended up needing a skin graft to repair the damage. The narrator says that she healed up okay in the end, but for about a year after the incident, she had this prominent patch of skin on her leg. That was a noticeably lighter shade than the rest of her skin. Their family is half Latino, so in the summer, when they'd go to the pool or wear shorts, that jarringly white patch of scar tissue was a constant, visible reminder of that horrible Thanksgiving. And what about the drunk uncle? The narrator says they don't talk to him anymore. It wasn't just because of what their family morbidly started calling Gravygate. Their mom said that incident was the beginning of the end for him and their family. And just in case anyone is thinking that he was just a man with a disease who made a mistake, the narrator wanted to make it clear that even after he supposedly sobered up years later, he was still a complete and utter idiot. The booze didn't have anything to do with his fundamental selfishness and lack of care for anyone but himself. That Thanksgiving, he didn't just burn his 5-year-old niece. He burned the last bridge he had with the entire family forever. Story 7. The Naked Man in the Woods. If you're a hunter or someone who spends a lot of time out in the wilderness, you know that the woods have their own set of rules, their own sounds, and their own deep, dark secrets. You also know that sometimes, if you're unlucky, you come across things out there that you just can't explain. This next story is one of those times. It's about an encounter that was so bizarre, so profoundly terrifying, that it made the person who sent it in question everything they thought they knew about the things that walk in the dark. Our narrator is a big hunter, and their specialty is wild boar. In their state, boars are considered an invasive species, so the rules for hunting them are pretty loose. You can hunt them at night, and you can use specialized gear that's illegal for other animals, like thermal vision scopes. They had been saving up for months to buy a new top-of-the-line thermal scope. It was an expensive piece of equipment, costing more than the rifle it was mounted on. But they were incredibly excited to try it out. They found the perfect spot they had scouted a few days earlier, a remote area with a ton of recent boar activity. It was a large clearing, easy to get to with their truck, and it offered a great vantage point for a night hunt. They got set up around 10 p.m. At first, the night was completely uneventful. They were mostly just getting a feel for their new toy, cycling through the different thermal settings, scanning the dark, empty clearing. They saw a few deer through the scope, but they were out of season. After a while, they started to notice something strange. The woods were too quiet. There were no rabbits, no raccoons, not even the sound of an owl. This patch of land that had been so full of life during the day was now eerily, unnaturally dead at night. By about 2 a.m., they were getting discouraged and were starting to think about packing it in for the night. They were just about to stand up when they heard a sharp crunch coming from the direction of where their truck was parked. They immediately brought the new thermal scope up to their eye and panned over toward the sound. Through the ghostly black and white thermal imaging, they saw the heat signature of what they initially thought was a small bear pushing its way through the thick bushes. They zoomed in a little to get a better look, and that's when they felt a jolt of confusion and fear run through their body. It wasn't a bear. It was a man. But he was moving all wrong. He was hunched over so low to the ground, moving on all fours, that his heat signature had looked exactly like an animal's. Their first thought was, is that a game warden? But that made no sense. They were miles from anywhere, and they would have seen the headlights of a vehicle on the long dirt road leading to the spot. This guy had to have walked here. They were about to call out to him when they adjusted the scope and noticed the most disturbing detail of all. He was completely naked. No shoes, no clothes, absolutely nothing. And his movements were just wrong. They were twitchy and unnatural, like a squirrel's. He was grabbing at leaves, sniffing the air, and palming the trees. He was sniffing the exact tree our narrator had been leaning against just an hour earlier. The terrifying thought hit them. Could he smell me? Then he did something that the narrator says they still have vivid nightmares about to this day. He squatted down low to the ground, placed his hands on the dirt between his feet, and stared straight up at the night sky, like a wolf about to howl. And then they heard it. A voice. It came from his direction, but it wasn't a man's voice. It was a high-pitched, compelling female voice, and it said, "Help, I'm lost." There was a long, dead silence. Neither of them moved a muscle. Our narrator's rifle was trained on the dirt in front of him. They just couldn't bring themselves to aim directly at another person. Their mind was racing. Was this some poor guy who had suffered a psychotic breakout here in the middle of nowhere? Why did his voice sound exactly like a woman's? Then the voice called out again, this time filled with a desperate panic. "Please, I can't walk." And that's when our narrator knew for certain he was lying. Not only could he walk, they had just seen him moving through the dense woods with an eerie, animalistic grace. This was a trap. He was using a classic damsel in distress routine to try and lure them out into the open. They had already started packing up most of their gear, so they quietly buckled their chest strap and grabbed their rifle. When they looked back through the scope, the man was in the same squatting position, but his head was now turned, and he was staring directly at them. Through the thermal scope, his eyes glowed a bright, unnatural white, just like an animal's. Our narrator swears they could see a smile on his face. He had heard them moving, from 150 yards away. He screamed at the top of their lungs, "Get the hell away from me." The man stood up then, and they realized how impossibly tall and skinny he was. He took a couple of long, loping strides in their direction, and they instinctively fired a warning shot over his head. He stopped dead in his tracks and dropped back down to all fours, his glowing eyes just barely visible over the tall grass. "The next one's gonna mess you up." "Go away," they yelled, their voice cracking with fear. They were locked in this terrifying standoff for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a sudden explosive movement, he bolted, moving impossibly fast into the tree line. Our narrator fired another shot in his direction and scrambled back to their truck, their heart pounding in their chest. For the longest time, they just told people they had a weird run-in with a deranged person on drugs. It wasn't until years later when they told the story to their nephew that they learned about the Native American folklore of wendigos and skinwalkers, creatures that are said to be able to mimic human voices to lure their prey into the woods. Our narrator isn't saying that's what they saw that night, but they are saying that if such things do exist, they may have dodged a bullet from something far older and more dangerous than any man. Story 8. The Grocery Store Stalkers. We all have that little voice in the back of our heads. That gut feeling that tells us when something is not quite right. Most of the time we try to ignore it, to rationalize it away. We don't want to seem paranoid or overreactive. But this next story is a terrifying reminder that sometimes you absolutely have to listen to that voice because it just might save your life. This happened to one of our viewers just a couple of weeks ago. She says she usually goes grocery shopping late in the evening, around 7 or 8 p.m., because the store is less crowded at that time. She's a pretty small woman, so she's always very aware of her surroundings. But she lives in a safe area, so she wasn't overly concerned about being out after dark. On this particular night, she was in her usual grocery store, her head down, focused on the shopping list on her phone. The store was a bit more crowded than usual, so she found herself having to make a few laps around certain sections while she waited for people to clear out. She was near the carrots in the produce section when she first noticed him. He was a man in a gray zip-up hoodie and a black baseball hat. They walked past each other in the aisle, going in opposite directions. She says he was walking really fast, and he was staring directly at her. She didn't think much of it at first. But a few minutes later, as she was gathering the rest of her produce and heading back towards the carrots, she passed him again. He made direct eye contact with her. She noticed that he still wasn't carrying a shopping basket or a cart, and he hadn't picked up a single item. It had been at least 3 or 4 minutes since she had first seen him, so it was definitely strange that he was just aimlessly wandering the produce section. As she made her way over to the bakery section of the store, he passed her for a third time. This time, she avoided eye contact, but as soon as he passed, she turned her head to watch where he was going. He was walking erratically, in all different directions, not following any logical path through the store. At this point, she was starting to get a little anxious. She says she has generalized anxiety disorder, so she was really trying to talk herself down, telling herself that she was just being paranoid. Who would follow her in a crowded grocery store? But then, as she was watching the first man, another guy, this one dressed all in black, ran past her. She says he ran so close to her that the gust of wind he created actually blew her hair back over her shoulder. He ran directly over to the man in the gray hoodie. She saw them start talking to each other, both of them looking directly at her. Okay now, she was officially freaked out. Her internal monologue of "you're just being paranoid" was starting to lose the argument. She decided to try and ignore them and just continue with her shopping, hoping they would lose interest. She looked back at her list and realized she had forgotten to grab lemons. So she had to turn around and go all the way back to the produce section yet again. As she was walking head down, a woman who was walking past her bumped into her shoulder. She was already on edge, so she was initially annoyed. But when she looked up to see who it was, their eyes locked, and she knew instantly that this was not an accident. It's a thing a lot of women do, this silent communication with just your eyes and body language, a way of looking out for each other in unsafe situations. And this woman was telling her something important. She subtly rolled her eyes downwards, in the exact direction of the 2 men who had been watching her. She didn't look directly at them, but our narrator knew who she was indicating. Then the woman looked back at her, and, in a clear but quiet whisper shout, said one thing. Heads up, her stomach sank. It was real. She wasn't being paranoid. Someone else had seen it too. Now she had a new and terrifying problem. She needed to get out of the store immediately, but she couldn't just abandon her cart and make a run for it. That would alert the men that she was onto them, and she had no idea what they would do if she did. So she tried to act casual, quickly navigating the aisles to grab the last few things on her list, so she would have a reason to be heading to the checkout. But now, they were everywhere. Every single aisle she went down, one of them was there, walking towards her from the opposite end. They were coordinating, boxing her in, cutting off her escape routes. She said she felt a wave of pure cold terror wash over her. She abandoned her list, made a beeline for the self-checkout, and got out of there as fast as she could, trying her best to appear calm and casual. Once she was done paying, she knew she couldn't walk out to her car alone in the dark parking lot. She saw 3 employees chatting near the exit and rushed over to them. Thinking on her feet, she told the female manager that her ex-boyfriend was in the store following her and that she was scared and needed to be walked to her car. She just wanted to get out of there with no questions asked. The manager immediately understood and called for a security guard to escort her. And as the security guard appeared, so did the 2 men. They were at the back of the self-checkout line watching her. As soon as they saw the security guard, they made eye contact with each other, and then one went left and one went right, splitting up to cover both of the store's exits. Our narrator's heart was in her throat. The security guard walked her all the way to her car and made sure she drove away safely. She has no idea what those men wanted, but she knows for a fact that the woman who took a second to warn her may have saved her from finding out. It's a chilling reminder to always trust your gut and to always look out for each other. Story 9. The Angel Lady Working in Retail, especially as a teenager. You meet your fair share of strange and memorable characters. But this next story is about a customer who went from being a weird but seemingly harmless regular to the source of the most terrifying experience of this young woman's life. This happened to our narrator when she was around 15 years old. She was working at a local news agency, mostly selling newspapers and lottery tickets to the people in her town. Among the regular customers was this older woman, probably in her late 40s or early 50s. Well, she says the woman looked much older than her years. She had scraggly, bleached blonde hair and always wore this over-the-top, gaudy, brightly colored makeup. She was one of those people who you could just tell was on something, and she would often ramble on about angels and demons and fairies. Our narrator just brushed it off as her being a bit eccentric and into some New Age spirituality. From the very first time this woman saw our narrator, she became completely mesmerized. She would run up to her coworkers and even other customers and loudly claim that this 15-year-old girl was an angel. She would tell her that she was pure and innocent and that she needed to return to the other angels. At first it was just weird, but our narrator was young and eager to please her boss with good customer service. So she would just smile and nod politely while the woman went on her fantastical rants. But over time, the woman's fascination grew into a disturbing fixation. She started to learn our narrator's work schedule. If she wasn't there on a particular day, the woman would frantically ask her coworkers where she was. She was also spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars a week on lottery tickets. But she would only buy them when our narrator was the one working the counter. She told her boss how uncomfortable the woman's obsession was making her. But he callously told her that she had to put up with it because the woman was bringing in so much money for the business. The situation began to escalate and bleed into her life outside of the shop. One day, as she was walking to the spot where her parents would pick her up after her shift, the woman appeared out of nowhere. She grabbed her arm tightly and asked if she wanted to go with her to return to the other angels. Luckily, an older coworker saw what was happening and intervened, pulling her away and staying with her until her dad arrived. After that incident, she was constantly on edge. She always felt like someone was watching her. The woman's ravings at the shop got even crazier and more desperate. She started telling her that the government was trying to poison her, that she had seen them slip cyanide into her food, and that she had to follow her right then and there to be safe. One time she even saw the woman lingering near her water bottle with something clutched in her hand. She moved her drink very quickly after that, her heart pounding. It all came to a terrifying climax one evening. When she was closing the shop by herself, to close up for the night, she had to lock the front roller doors and then exit through a back door that led to a shady, completely deserted concrete area behind the building. She described it as a concrete jungle with all these twists and turns and tall walls that blocked the view from the street. As she locked the back door behind her, she felt incredibly uneasy. She thought she could hear someone breathing behind her, but when she turned around, she saw no one. She told herself it was just her paranoia getting the best of her. As she pulled out her phone to check if her dad was on his way to pick her up, a hand clamped down hard on her shoulder. Her whole body froze. Before she even looked, she knew who it was. When she turned around, the angel lady was standing there, a huge manic grin on her face. The woman pulled her into this tight, unwanted hug that she had to wriggle free from. She knew something was very wrong and she tried to run, but the woman grabbed her arm again. She was surprisingly strong. The woman started talking to her, trying to distract her, all while sprinkling in these comments about how the angels were so excited to be reunited with her. She had no idea what was happening until she heard the sound of a vehicle pulling up around the corner. A white van, with all of its windows completely blacked out, was slowly creeping towards them. She says she will never forget the look on that lady's face as the van approached. "Let's go," she said, her voice filled with a chilling excitement. "The angels have been waiting. We'll be with them again soon." She doesn't know how she did it, but some kind of superhuman strength born of pure terror surged through her. She ripped her arm free from the woman's grasp just as the van was slowing down beside them, and she ran. She knew the twists and turns of that concrete labyrinth, and she sprinted through it, her heart pounding in her ears. She ducked behind a large concrete pillar and held her breath, trying to silence the jangling of her keys as her body shook with fear. She could hear the woman and someone else, a man, running around, checking corners, searching for her. After about 15 minutes, which felt like an eternity, they seemed to give up, and she heard the van roll away. She waited, terrified, and then ran for her life, thankfully finding her dad waiting for her at their usual spot. She never saw the angel lady again, and she can only imagine what would have happened if she hadn't managed to get away. Story 10. The Obsessive Ex. This last story is a terrifyingly intimate look at how a past relationship can curdle into a dangerous obsession, and how stalking can escalate from social awkwardness to a genuine threat to your life. This story was shared by a young man, and it's about his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend. He says that when he first started dating his girlfriend, Isabel, she told him about a less-than-ideal relationship. She had been in a couple of years prior. The ex-boyfriend, a guy named Jose, was still very much in their lives. They all went to the same high school, and after graduation, he ended up enrolling in the same university as them. To make matters even more complicated, all three of them attended the same church. This meant there was almost no escaping him. The creepy encounters with Jose started almost immediately after he found out that our narrator and Isabel were dating. Says Jose was furious. He even went as far as to go on Twitter and make up lies, accusing our narrator of being abusive. Luckily, no one believed him, as Jose had a notorious reputation for doing the exact same thing to other guys Isabel had talked to in the past. It was his way of trying to isolate her and control her social life. But that was just the beginning. The stalking started out small at first. He would just happen to be at the same mall whenever they went out on dates. After a while, it was happening so often that it was clearly no coincidence. Then he started showing up at their church, which on its own wouldn't be that strange. But he then immediately joined the exact same youth ministry that they were a part of. It seemed like he was trying to insert himself into every aspect of their lives, to get as close to them as he possibly could. There was one incident that our narrator says he remembers very specifically. It was at a high school graduation party that everyone from their class was invited to. He was standing on the patio with Isabel, and when he looked across the crowded backyard, he saw Jose just standing there, staring at them. He said his eyes didn't move, and he was breathing heavily, like he was filled with this intense, barely contained rage. He didn't try anything that night, probably because there were too many people around. But after our narrator dropped Isabel off at her house, he noticed a black car following him for most of the way home. The next day, that same car was tailing him all day, while he was out running errands. The situation finally boiled over that afternoon. He was sitting in his car in a store parking lot, waiting for a curbside pickup order, when Jose pulled into a space a few spots down, got out of his car and walked right up to his window. He started screaming at him, yelling that he would never be good enough for Isabel. She still loved him no matter what, and that he was going to make sure that they were never together. Our narrator just tried to ignore him, knowing that starting a fight would only make things worse. That night, things escalated to a whole new level of terror. He was at home, and as he was walking through his living room, he glanced out the window and saw him. Jose was just standing there on the sidewalk across the street, under a street lamp, staring directly at his house. His parents saw him too, and asked him to go outside and see what was going on. But as soon as our narrator stepped out the front door, Jose got in his car and sped off. This happened every night for the next 3 nights. He would just stand there, a silent, menacing presence watching their house. On the last night he ever saw him, something was different. When he went outside, Jose didn't leave. In fact, he started walking from the sidewalk, across the street, and directly towards him, up his driveway. Our narrator says he didn't notice it until he was much closer, but Jose was holding something in his hand. It was a large kitchen knife, its blade glinting under the porch light. Adrenaline kicked in, and he ran back into the house, screaming at his mom to call 911. He then went back outside to confront him, not wanting him to get any closer to his family. Jose was now standing in his front yard, waiting. When he saw our narrator come back outside, he said, "Isabel belongs to me, and I'm going to make that happen no matter what." He then charged at him with the knife. Our narrator had done martial arts for years, and his training kicked in. He was able to disarm him and pin him to the ground. Just as the police were arriving, he explained the entire situation, the months of stalking and harassment, and Jose was immediately arrested. But the most chilling part of the story is what the police found when they searched Jose's car. Inside, they discovered a horrifying kit: a roll of duct tape, coil of rope, another large knife, a handgun, and a video camera. He doesn't know for sure what Jose had planned for him that night, but looking at that collection of items, he can make a pretty good guess. He hates to think what would have happened if Jose had managed to get inside the house while his family was asleep. But he is incredibly thankful that his terrifying ordeal with his girlfriend's obsessive ex was finally over.